Good day, good day, good day, and welcome to another episode of Drew's Book Reviews. Today, September 30th, is a very special day here in Canada. It is Orange Shirt Day, or National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This is a day that we mark to come to terms with the history of the residential schools, to reconcile what happened to our First Nations community here in Canada, and the horrors and the atrocities and the terrible genocide that had happened to them. And it is in honor of truth and reconciliation of this day, of this important yet horrendous part of our history, that we need to acknowledge what happened to this particular group of people that I chose to read this month. A book written by a First Nations author. A book that tells the story of one of these children who were unfortunately traumatized by the residential school system. Today we're going to be talking about Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. Now, it is important to note that this book contains a lot of trigger warning, and I have to tell you that up front because it deals with horrendous issues of genocide and horrendous abuse and inflicted upon these people, and the pain and suffering and anguish that these people had to deal with throughout their experiences at the residential schools, which is what this book is about. This book follows the story of a young boy and his experiences of how his life led him to the residential schools, how he tried to cope with the trauma that was being inflicted upon him at this school, and how he came to be where he is today. And this is a heart-wrenching story, and it is powerful, and it is an extremely emotional, draining read. I actually read this book in one sitting because I just couldn't put it down. It was so powerful. It just drew me in so effectively with the story that this boy had experienced, and I wanted to read something in honor of truth and reconciliation, in honor of learning more about the First Nations community and what they experienced. I wanted to read something from their viewpoint and what they had experienced. This book, while it is written as a fictional tale, it is drawn from real-world experiences and based on true stories that actually happened within the residential school system here in Canada, and it is just a brutal story. At the age of 6, our character is taken to St. Jerome's residential school, which I believe was in Northern Ontario. I could be wrong on its location, but I think that was in Northern Ontario, or Winnipeg. One of those two, or not Winnipeg, or Manitoba, one of those two areas. But it was a residential school run by the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church ran most of the residential schools in Canada, and the thing is, this is not old history. This isn't something that happened 100 or 200 years ago. This is a system that was in operation for over a century, and the last one actually closed when I was in high school in 1996. And honestly, I didn't learn anything about residential schools when I was in school. It was hardly ever talked about, and the odd time it came up, the truth about what was going on in these schools and what they were actually like was never mentioned. In fact, I didn't even learn in high school in 1996 when I was in grade 10 that the last residential school had closed. I wasn't even aware that they were still in operation when I was in junior high, which was just crazy when you think about it. Absolutely insane that the truth about what happened in these schools was covered up. And that is why it is so vitally important for us to learn about what really happened. Thousands of kids died in this system, and it was just torture. And so reading this story was very difficult. It was emotionally draining, emotionally taxing to hear and see, and from the viewpoint of Richard Wagamese. And just before we kind of get into the more details of this story, I just want to share some of the quotes I took from the book, which for me were very powerful and very effective in portraying what was going on within this school and how our character saw the feeling and some of his family's experiences. He starts out the book here, where he says a little bit about, by telling our stories, hardcore drunks like me can set ourselves free from the bottle and the life that took us there. If we want to live at peace with ourselves, we need to tell our stories. And in speaking of his mother, our storyteller Saul tells us, the school, she would whisper, the school. It was the school that Naomi hid from us. It was the school that had turned my mother so far inward she sometimes ceased to exist in the outside world. I grew up afraid of the white man. As it turned out, I had reason to be. They took me to St. Jerome's Indian residential school. St. Jerome's took all the light from my world. Everything I knew vanished behind me with an audible swish. I could never understand how the God they proclaimed was watching over us and can turn his head away and ignore such cruelty and suffering. I saw kids die of tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, and broken hearts at St. Jerome's. I saw young boys and girls die standing on their own 2 feet. I saw runaways carried back, frozen solid as boards. I saw bodies hung from the rafters on thin ropes. I saw wrists slashed and the cascade of blood on the bathroom floor. And one time, a young boy impaled on the tines of a pitchfork that he'd shoved through himself. I watched a girl calmly fill the pockets of her apron with rocks and walk away across the field. She went to the creek and sat on the bottom and drowned. That would never stop, never change, so long as that school stood in its place at the top of that ridge, as long as they continued to pull Indian kids from the bush and from the arms of their people. So I retreated. That's how I survived, alone. When the tears threatened to erupt from me at night, I vowed they would never hear me cry. I ached in solitude. What I let them see was a quiet, withdrawn boy, void of feeling. Just those parts alone of this book, I really feel express the raw torment and emotion and the anguish that he felt having to live in this school system. And as we go further through the story, we start to learn that his only escape from this horrid reality that he had experienced was in the game of hockey. He taught himself, he played hard, and he lost himself to the game of hockey. And he actually became pretty good at the game of hockey. And it's something that took him out of this world of misery and depression and the horrible experiences that he had to deal with, of the absolutely horrid treatment that himself and his fellow students at the residential school had to endure. Hockey became his escape, and he got so good at this, he was eventually recruited to play in a real hockey team and go up against other teams. And as we progress through the story and we learn more about his involvement in the hockey world and where it takes him and where it leads him, he eventually has the opportunity to play professionally. But it doesn't end there. That's the thing. He had this opportunity, and as he continued to play these other teams, he soon realized that this isn't an escape for him that he thought it would be. We go through his experiences as he's dealing with the blatant hate and racism that he ends up being faced with throughout the hockey world, and how hockey turned into something that he loved to escape the horror and the terror and the anguish that he had to deal with in the residential school systems. Now, the one escape for him, the one thing that he cared about most, the one thing that brought him some joy, has now been destroyed for him. It's no longer fun for him. It's not an escape anymore because of the racism and the hate that is constantly thrown out. He's targeted. His own teammates won't support him. And he is constantly targeted, and he turns into this hockey goon where he doesn't care anymore. The racist headlines about him, and he just loses it, and he becomes excessively angry at what is happening to him because the thing that he loves has been taken from him, which leads him to alcoholism and drug addiction. And this is his story. This is not a happy story, not by a long shot. It is not a happy story, but it is a good story, and it is written so well and so effectively. And definitely, like I said, this book is trigger warning. If you are sensitive to issues of rape and genocide and violence and abuse against children, this is probably not the book that you want to be reading. But I can tell you that this book is worth reading. It is just heartbreaking to read the story from the perspective of someone who had experienced the horrors that is the residential school system. And I really am glad that I read this book. I am very happy that this was the viewer's choice review for this month. And I am so glad I had the opportunity to read this book. And you should pick it up and read it. But have the trigger warning. It's there. Be aware of that. If you like what I've had to say about this, if you've read this or watched the movie, if you've read this book, please let me know down in the comments below or join me on my Discord. I would love to have a chat with you about Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. It really is a worthwhile read, but it is an intense read. It is a heartbreaking and very emotional read. So those are my thoughts here on Richard Wagamese's Indian Horse. I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know in the comments down below. Have you read this book? Have you read any books like this? Are you interested in reading this book? Let me know what you thought down below. I'd love to hear from you, or chat me up on the Discord, or follow me on my Bookstagram. All that will be linked below. And as always, until next time, keep on reading. Bye!